just a few comments of reminiscences that might help to inform the conference we're about to hear. I started my career studying biochemistry in Oxford in 1952. The lecturer in microbiology was Donald Woods, famed, I think, for putting sulfonamides into the medical field. He gave lectures to us on microbiology. One of them I missed, but was told about it soon afterwards. In it, he described some microbiology, and during his lecture, he put funny little signs or squiggles on the blackboard and just went on talking. And then the lecture finished, and there was the usual discussion and questions and answers, and somebody piped up and said, "Excuse me, Professor, what are those funny little signs you put on the blackboard?" And he said, "Oh, they're to keep the elephants away." And everybody twittered, like you. And there was more discussion, and then somebody else piped up, said, "But, Professor, there are no elephants here." And he said, "Precisely." So there was the first lesson, that I'm going to extend the science from that to the metaphorical elephant in the room rather than real elephants. In Oxford at the time, it was just the moment when the unit round Hans Krebs in Sheffield was about to come to Edinburgh, he taking the chair of biochemistry. And just in the nick of time, the importation of the most gigantic elephant in biochemical history, I think, was prevented from being imported into Oxford by Sandy Ogston. The problem was this. Krebs had been working, and later received a Nobel Prize for, what is now known as the Krebs cycle, the tricarboxylic acid cycle. And his team, in 1954, were among the earliest users of radioactive tracers to trace the course of the reactions that they postulated. And citric acid, a tricarboxylic acid, was one of the important intermediates in what became known as the tricarboxylic acid or Krebs cycle. And, at that time, they puzzled because you could feed into the cycle a 2-carbon radioactive compound, and it would join this part of the cycle of 4 carbon atoms to join together to make the 6-carbon tricarboxylic acids. And they did that and found that the product of citric acid, which should be an intermediate in the cycle, the product was labeled only at one end. The product was alpha-ketoglutarate. It was labeled only at one end. How could citric acid, which is symmetrical, optically inactive? We all know symmetrical molecules are the same at both ends, by definition. They spent 8 years, I was told, puzzling how to keep citric acid in the tricarboxylic acid cycle, like inventing side branches which would keep it out of the way and yet available, and somehow both be asymmetric in its direct cycling and symmetrical, and yet not randomize the label between the two ends. And just then, Sandy Ogston was sitting in his office in Oxford, pondering another related problem another compound he'd come across with the same question in his work on hyaluronic acid. And he suddenly dawned on him as he was twiddling his pencil. Of course, the two ends are different. They're optical isomers of each other. In 3 dimensions, they're different. Enzymes can distinguish them. He wrote it up in those terms of 3 dimensions and enzyme 3-point contacts and so on. And he wrote it up that way and became famous overnight. 2 Augustons, one on hyaluronic acid and the other on solving this 8-year-old problem of the Krebs cycle. He and Krebs then corresponded extensively. I've got some of the correspondence, and the biggest elephant in the room was averted from coming to Oxford. Think of it, you are symmetrical. And yet you can distinguish both hands with no difficulty, whether attached to you or not. You're symmetrical, but your left and your right are different. They had not seen that simple point. At the time, biochemistry was young. It was born around 1905 with the realization that the metabolic reactions of the cell could be studied in solution in the test tube. And that idea stuck in what later became known, and I'll describe that, as the bag of enzymes theory. It said that you could, in the end, if you studied the enzymes in the test tubes dissolved, you'd know the whole of metabolism. A myth. That myth was penetrated to a small extent by one Barnett Wolfe in Cambridge, young scientist who studied the binding of the relatively newly synthesized artificial dyestuff, methylene blue, and it bound to the cytochromes just like a natural compound would. The cytochromes are natural enzymes. The enzymes were magic catalysts to the bag of enzymes crowd. They didn't like the notion that one of their natural catalysts could bind to a completely artificial compound. They resisted his studies, but he published them in 1930 and either were kicked out of Cambridge or felt he had to leave. Anyway, he left. You'll hear about him a little later in my talk. So that was the first prick in the simple notion that enzymes do what you think. And they can, in fact, equally combine with and react with completely unnatural compounds. At that time also, my tutor in biochemistry, gave lectures in biochemistry, warned we name the enzymes after the reaction that they did by which we first discovered them. It has nothing to do with what they do in the cell. One needs to think further about that. I won't say more about that now. The warning was early, 1953 or 4. Then, for other reasons, I and a team of cell biologists moved to Edinburgh. And in Edinburgh, we met a whole lot of new, interesting scientists. Among them, Peter Mitchell, who came to see us at home in 1960 or 61, when we'd first arrived in Scotland. Here was this young scientist from Oxford who purportedly could make instruments to measure things. And he, I think, looking back, but I can't remember exactly, what he really wanted to see was whether I could devise a means of measuring pH and redox potential across membranes in a cell. He could also have been looking, as I realized later, for a colleague he could work with who would understand his stuff. I didn't seem to satisfy either of those criteria, but we remained in good contact and remained good friends. And over the years, he and I talked quite a lot. He was trying to show how the bag of enzymes people can never make it. What it needed was the structure of the cell. The membranes had in them insoluble enzymes which did their work in ways that a soluble enzyme cannot do. So there were two teams, the bag of enzymes, as he called them, that was his phrase, and the cell structural biologists. He wanted to join the teams. But his colleagues in zoology did not really appreciate what he was on about. He got more and more frustrated. He had a bad ulcer. He decided he would use a fortune to buy a house near Bodmin, I think in Cornwall or Devon, and take one technician with him and set up a lab downstairs in 2 rooms in that mansion. And that he did. And in that way, he could go on with his work unfettered by criticisms around him, unfettered by the problems of publication. He published from Bodmin himself, unfettered by peer reviews, unfettered by any interference. He could just get on with the job. And he explained to me, I don't know when, later or before, how gradually the number of, I'm looking at the video here, the number of people of the bag of enzymes crowd gradually declined, and the number of followers of the structural biology crowd gradually grew. And as it turned out, and he went on publishing, when those 2 lines crossed, and the majority were structural biologists who followed what he then called, now a forgotten term, the chemi-osmotic theory of how cells work. Now isn't needed, we've done it. But shortly after those lines crossed, he won the Nobel Prize, and the rest is history. I met him once at a SIBA conference in London, sometime then, before his Nobel Prize, I think. Somebody came up to him in the reception in the crowd in the SIBA conference and said, "Hello, Peter, I haven't seen you for a long time. Good to see you again. You look more like Beethoven than ever." He indeed had a rough appearance, scraggly hair, sharp eyes, and, ironically, was profoundly deaf. That was Peter Mitchell. I met many others in Edinburgh. Among them, Conrad Waddington, came from Cambridge with another story, heretical story. His experiments had shown that some chemical interferences in a growing embryo would change that embryo so that it developed into a slightly different organism. And if you repeated that after a few times of doing it, that change became inherited. It went on without the chemical, and he called that change genetic assimilation. It challenged the old Lamarckian idea. Lamarck thought that acquired characteristic would be inherited. That was totally debunked by the establishment, and Waddington challenged it. So much so, he followed it with a lot of work in Edinburgh, that he had to coin new words. He coined many words. The first is epigenetics. Epigenetics became a new subject. He built a whole building around it. He attracted a lot more people. Among them, the aforesaid Barnett Wolff. Barnett Wolff became the guru for statistical advice for all biologists of the whole of science in Edinburgh. Everybody, including me, went to him to have their calculations clarified by Barnett Wolff. He also became the joker in the lab. Waddington, with his fame by then, and actually perhaps with his heretical views, travelled a lot. So he was often away from the lab. Barnett Wolff said, "A half-time professor can be expected to be in the lab for half the time. Perfectly reasonable. A full-time professor can be expected to be in the lab for none of the time." That was the first of his quips of how the lab was run. The second, and there were more, was this laboratory is run on purely democratic lines. One man, one vote. That was Barnett Wolff. After all those years from 1920s, 30s to 1970s and 80s. Alongside came a whole lot of people that Waddington attracted, many European refugees from Eastern Europe, among them Henry Katcher. Henry Katcher was a genius who, in a way, was the co-founder with Waddington of what we now call systems biology. That you need to look at the whole of something, not just the bit you were studying. And Katcher came to me one day with a twinkle in his eye. And he said, "I think you'll like the new paper I have published." I looked at it. Its title was Molecular Democracy. It showed what Fisher had predicted. We do not know what, and cannot know, what the enzymes are really doing. They are doing their own thing in their own democratic way, and there's a huge amount of mathematics that I do not understand at all, so I don't understand that paper, but I remember well the occasion and the twinkle in his eye. He knew that I knew that there was something to do there. That was Henry Katcher. I'm just lost for a second. Waddington did a lot of other things. Late in his life, he founded the School of the Man-Made Future to teach environmental science to all undergraduates. And he wrote a book to show the development of science. I think it followed his earlier book on the scientific attitude of just pre and post Second World War. This was 1970-something, published posthumously. Tools for Thought. Tools for Thought introduced another word. All his other words, as I think I've said, for epigenetics and embryology were Greek. Here he coined another term, which was purely Anglo-Saxon. It was cow dung, and it stood for conventional wisdom of the dominant group. He pointed out that it doesn't fit exactly, but it's good enough. So that was Tools for Thought and Waddington. Meanwhile, of course, the whole story of DNA and the central dogma of molecular biology had grown from its beginnings in 1953 to now, and still growing. And all the way through, every few years, there's another major discovery which upsets what had been found before. Upsets it in a way that means that the molecular biologists have to invent new ways to fit their ideas into that growing central dogma. In a way, it's like planting ever more, what are they called, epicycles into the Ptolemaic universe. You can go on doing it. You can still get the Ptolemaic universe wrong. And that's what's happening now. Now, there's a big picture of the DNA story with lots and lots of complications of RNA that controls things, controls genes, of a simplification of epigenetics to labeling by cytosine, lots of things that I'm not going to describe. There is a picture too fantastic to believe. A picture so complex, that's not what DNA is really doing. There's something else there that we don't know about yet. But the DNA people, another elephant, believe that they have something up their sleeve that is right. The belief in the impossible fantasy is so strong that one has to recall the poem by Hilaire Belloc. Let us not doubt, let us never doubt what nobody is sure about. And with that, as an epitaph for everything I've tried to say, I want you to raise your glasses to the European network of scientists for spotting elephants in the room.
Yes.